So, Socrates. Socrates' reputation, as I've tried to emphasize, suffered as a result of his philosophizing. Why did it suffer? Because he revealed that his fellow Athenian citizens believed in all sorts of silly things. He reveals that they're ignorant, that they claim to know something, but they don't in fact know. He revealed that their views are highly prejudiced. And I don't just mean prejudiced in terms of bigotry. I mean prejudiced in terms of not receptive to the truth. They entertain all sorts of falsehoods, right? So as a result of its philosophizing, again, he's going around town, questioning people, interrogating their views, revealing that when they claim to know something, they don't in fact know something. But it's not just any old citizens he's questioning. He's especially questioning the powerful, the people who claim to know, the people who have this influential role in the poets, the craftsmen, most of all the politicians. You can see how this starts to piss off some very powerful people. And that's why he's being put on trial, right? And his philosophizing draws the suspicion, the distrust of his fellow citizens. Indeed, it draws the ire of the jury more generally, more specifically, I should say, right? His defense speech, as I mentioned before, does not make him any friends. He doesn't win over the jury with this sort of defense speech, with this apologia. It's not much of an apology at all, is it? Right? As I said, more people on the jury voted to put him to death than voted in the initial part of the trial to find him guilty, right? So he does not win anybody over with this defense speech. But was that his goal? Was his goal to persuade the jury to set him free? Well, if that's his goal, he did a terrible job. If he was a sophist and he was just concerned with his self-interest, escaping this death sentence, then yeah, he did a terrible job. But was that his goal in his defense speech? Was he really defending himself? Or was he defending the life of philosophy? Because if he's doing the latter, then it doesn't matter if he's put to death and found guilty. If his concern is with the truth and not with his own self-interest, then it doesn't matter what sentence they pass upon it. And that's arguably what his goal was, is not to defend himself, but to defend the life of philosophy, the contemplative life, the life of examination. And indeed, that's why Socrates is cherished by many philosophers, even to this day, because he's viewed as a patron saint of philosophy. He's viewed as a martyr for the cause of philosophy. Here he is challenging the norms, the perspectives of his fellow citizens, the social norms of Athens, the moral values of Athens. And he's put to death for it, like a brave martyr for some political cause, right? Now, Socrates is sometimes referred to as a gadfly of civilization. What is a gadfly of civilization? Well, what's a gadfly? It's like a little bug. It's always buzzing around, always bothering you, pestering you. Get away from me. That's what Socrates is doing. He's pestering the people of Athens. He's like a little bug, little mosquito, always buzzing around, bugging them, interrogating them, pestering them. In that sense, Socrates views himself as a gadfly of civilization, as a gadfly of Athens, always there, obligated as a philosopher to challenge the views of his fellow Athenians, to provoke them into discussion, to interrogate their conclusions, to question and challenge, like a philosophical gadfly. And ever since Socrates, philosophers have had this reputation. You philosophers are rabble rousers, always causing trouble, always promoting unrest, always stoking social division, never just minding your own business. Indeed, Socrates tells his jury, I cannot mind my own business. Why? Because he's been sent on a divine task to act as a gadfly for Athens. He's been given a divine mission from the gods themselves to philosophize, to be the gadfly of Athens, as he puts it in the trial, or at least as his student Plato put it. It seems to me that God has attached me to the city to perform the office of a fly, always rousing, always persuading, always reproving each and every one of you. Now, if you folks put me to death, you will not easily find someone to take my place. Socrates is telling his jurymen, I'm performing a social function. I'm performing a vital role for Athenian society as the gadfly of Athens. And if you put me to death, nobody's going to take my place. Me, this messenger from the gods themselves. You will not easily find someone to replace me. You can see why this pissed off more people on the jury. You can see maybe why more people decided on the jury to put Socrates to death than decided to find him guilty in the first place. Because of comments like this, he's not winning over his audience. He's not winning over the hearts and minds of the jury, nor is he trying to do that. He's trying to defend the life of philosophy rather than to defend himself, rather than to defend his own life. He's not a sophist. He's a lover of wisdom, lover of philosophy. Now, many of us have heard of this phrase before: ignorance is bliss. As if you don't think about things, if you don't seek wisdom, if you're not a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, philosophia, if you're ignorant of all that, then you'll live a happier life, a more blissful existence. No, says Socrates. Socrates does not believe in that mantra, that ignorance is bliss. On the contrary, Socrates believes that the good life, the only life worth living, is one devoted to contemplation, is one devoted to the examination of one's own views, self-examination, and the critical examination of the views of others around you. The good life is associated with philosophia, with a love of wisdom, not ignorance. In fact, sometimes this formula is used to express Socrates's, the pathway that Socrates sketches out to find happiness. Knowledge equals virtue, and we'll learn more when we get to Aristotle what these Greek philosophers mean by virtue. They're not necessarily what we mean today by virtue. We'll talk about that when we get to Aristotle. But Socrates says knowledge equals virtue, and virtue equals happiness. And so the pathway to happiness it begins with knowledge. It begins with a love of wisdom. That's why Socrates is taking up this mantle, this divine task of being a gadfly for the city of Athens. As he tells his fellow jurymen, let no day pass without discussing goodness. If you know what's good for you, if you want to live the good life, the only life worth living as a human being, if you want to live a life worthy of that title, human, then you'll take up the cause of philosophy. You'll have a thirst for wisdom. You'll seek out knowledge, not remain ignorant. Ignorance is not bliss, no. The good life stems from a life of philosophy, from a contemplative life, a life of examination. Now, the good life for Socrates is therefore not one devoted to wealth or reputation or status or pleasure. And we're going to see this clearly when we get to Aristotle as well. Aristotle will say the same thing. Happiness, says Aristotle, is not about the pursuit of wealth, not about money making. Happiness is not about pleasure, the vulgar pleasures of the flesh. Happiness is not about honor or reputation or fame, says Aristotle. He's borrowing all of those themes from Socrates, folks. Socrates feels the exact same way. The good life, the only life worth living, is the examined life of philosophy, the contemplative life, not the life devoted to these slavish passions and pleasures, not the life devoted to accumulating gold trinkets, not the life devoted to consuming commodities. No, life devoted to the spirit of philosophy, a life devoted to the search for wisdom. Now, for the Greeks, when they talk about the good life, what they're talking about is the actualization, the realization in one's own life of what they call the good, capital G, the good. What is the good? Well, as a generalization about Greek philosophy, the good is often seen as being composed of three parts. It has a sort of tripartite division, a threefold division to it. There are the intellectual virtue, the intellectual ideal, the aesthetic ideal, right? Aesthetics is about beauty, the philosophy of beauty and art, and the ethical ideal. So there are three ideals: the intellectual, the aesthetic, and the ethical. What are those ideals? Truth is the intellectual ideal. Beauty is the ideal of aesthetic philosophy, and love or friendship, by which the Greeks meant they considered friendship to be a form of love. Love is the ethical ideal. Those three things together, if you can realize, if you can actualize in your own life, these three ideals, the intellectual, the aesthetic, and the ethical ideal of truth, beauty, and love, you can count yourself a blessed individual. That, says Socrates, is a good life. That is a life worth living, a life in which you realize the good in your own existence. So as Socrates says, wealth does not bring goodness. It's not, you want to be happy in life, think Socrates, don't spend your time in those vain pursuits, those idle pursuits of wealth, accumulating as many little gold coins as you can. What a waste of a life. The only life worth living is the philosophical life, says Socrates, not a life devoted to entrepreneurial activities, not a life devoted to accumulating profit and possessions and property. So for Socrates, the good life, the life worth living, the happy life, the fulfilling life, is not a life devoted to pleasure, to wealth, or to fame, reputation, and honor. It's not, as I put it here, about fortune, fame, or fun. It's about your intellectual and moral well-being. It's about what Socrates calls the well-being of the soul, the well-being of your intellectual self, the well-being of your moral character. That's where the good life is derived from. Your own character as an individual. And if your character is devoted to slavish pursuits, like the pursuit of pleasure, physical pleasure, like the pursuit of wealth and money and property, possessions, like the pursuit of fame and reputation and glory, well, your hopes for happiness will be dashed, thinks Socrates, as he insists to his fellow jurymen, his fellow Athenian citizens, make your chief and first concern not your bodies nor your possessions, but the highest welfare of your souls, of your intellectual and moral self. So the good life for Socrates is a life of virtue, a life of happiness, a life spent developing and cultivating your own mental and moral capabilities. It's about the wealth, not of possessions, not of commodities, not of property. It's about the wealth of your own human nature, the wealth of your own personality as an individual, the wealth of your intellectual and ethical development, the wealth of your mental and moral character as an individual. That's what the good life is about. Remember, if the good is about truth and beauty and love, in order to realize those things in your life, you need to develop your intellectual abilities, your mental abilities. That's how you attain truth. You need to develop your artistic and creative abilities. That's how you create beauty and art. And you need to develop your ethical and moral capacities. That's how you can form good, meaningful relationships with others, friendly, loving relations with others. So to realize the good in your own life, to live a good life, means developing the wealth of your own human nature, the intellectual, aesthetic, and moral wealth of your own human character. That's why Socrates condemns, reproaches his fellow countrymen on that jury. And he tells them, are you not ashamed, folks, that you give your attention to acquiring as much money as possible and give no attention or thought to truth and understanding and the perfection of your own soul? Imagine being more concerned with where to find the nicest pottery, the nicest clothes in Athens. And instead of being more concerned with how to acquire virtue, with how to live a happy and meaningful life. Imagine that shallow life. It's one too many of us lead. And philosophy is not relevant for now in our days, eh? Philosophy has no purpose, eh? What could be more purposeful than knowing how to live well, knowing how to find happiness in one's life, knowing how to find meaning and purpose in one's life? What could be more practical than that? And people say philosophy doesn't serve a purpose. Philosophy has no practical utility. Yeah. Let's all just pursue wealth as if it really mattered. No, Socrates tells you what you should do. You should live a life of philosophy. So in his role as a gadfly for Athens, he's trying to persuade, in his final act of philosophy, right before he's going to be put to death, he's trying to persuade those jurymen, not to relieve him of guilt, not to free him. No. He's trying to defend not his own life, but the life of philosophy, the philosophical life of contemplation. He's trying to persuade his fellow countrymen on the jury, his fellow Athenians, not to let him off the hook. No, he cares not about death. He's trying to convince them to focus on their own mental and moral development, the development and the well-being of their own soul, as he puts it. Socrates has lived an examined life. He's lived a life of philosophy. He's lived well. He's lived the good life. And he's now trying to tell his fellow Athenians on the jury, you're living an unexamined life. And the unexamined life, the unphilosophical life, the uncontemplative life is a life not worth living, says Socrates. You're going to devote your time to the pursuit of pleasures. You're going to devote your time to the pursuit of reputation and honor and fame. You're going to devote your time to the pursuit of money and property and possessions. What a waste of a life. That sort of unexamined life, says Socrates, is not worth living. Doesn't deserve the honor bestowed upon it when we call it a human life. You want to live a life worthy of that noble title, human? Live the philosophical life, says Socrates. And he tells his jurymen that. I don't care for the things that most people care about. You folks, you care about making money, about having a comfortable home, about achieving a high military or civil rank. I've tried to persuade you, says Socrates, when I was out in the streets, when I was in the marketplace questioning the politicians and the poets and the craftsmen, I tried to persuade each one of you not to think of such practical advantages more than you do about your own mental and moral well-being, the welfare of your own soul. So, for Socrates, we know the good life is not about money. It's not about fortune, fun, or fame. It's a life of contemplation. The philosophical life, the examined life, the contemplative life, says Socrates, is the very best thing that a man can do for himself. Life without this sort of examination is simply not worth living. In fact, at one point in the trial, Socrates states clearly, if you were to say to me, says Socrates, oh, Socrates, we'll let you off the hook. We won't sentence you to death as long as you promise not to philosophize anymore, as long as you promise not to be the gadfly of Athens anymore, as long as you promise not to go around town questioning and challenging everybody's views. Socrates says, if that was the condition for my release, I wouldn't take it up. I'd rather die a philosopher than live as one of you ignorant masses, than live the unexamined life like you hollow folks. If that was the condition for my acquittal, sentence me now, says Socrates. Happily will I go to death. So long as I draw breath and have my mental faculties with me, I shall never stop practicing philosophy and exhorting to each and every one of you and elucidating the truth for everyone that I meet. Never will I stop living this philosophical life, even if you put me to death, says Socrates. And that's what they did. And he stood by his rhetoric. He stood by his principles. That's why he's seen as a martyr for the cause of philosophy today. Here he was standing against the injustices of his society, against the immorality of this death sentence imposed upon him. Here he is, an innocent man being put to death. He cares not an inkling for himself. He cares not an inkling for the well-being of his body before the well-being of his soul. He cares not an inkling for the death sentence imposed upon him than he does for the philosophical life, the life of examination. That's what he cares about, primarily speaking. The life of examination, the contemplative life, the life of philosophy. And that's why, the reason why he's not fearful of death is because he doesn't regard death as a misfortune. Indeed, Socrates doesn't regard anything as a misfortune in life, including death, something to be feared. When most people talk about misfortune, they're poverty, sickness, a death sentence imposed upon you. Most people regard that as a misfortune. Not so for Socrates. As he tells his fellow Athenians, after they sentence him to death, I go to die and you go to live. But which of us is happier is unknown to any of us. Socrates is telling you, I'm agnostic on the question of an afterlife. I don't know if there's an afterlife. I don't know if my immortal soul, when I die, is going to go to some heavenly realm or not. I'm ignorant of what happens after death. If you're ignorant of something, folks, if you don't know what happens after death, then why would you fear it? Socrates gives you two options. Look, if we die, either there's going to be nothingness, and why would you be afraid of nothing? Nothing is nothingness. How can you be afraid of nothing? You can only be afraid of something, right? You won't feel nothingness. You won't be conscious. Sometimes we picture death as nothingness, and we picture ourselves in like a black space, an empty space. No, you won't be picturing anything. You won't be perceiving anything, neither whiteness nor blackness, neither light nor dark. Nothing. If your consciousness dissolves at the moment of death, that's that. Why would you be afraid of that? Were you afraid of the eternity that preceded your birth? Before you were born, you didn't exist. Is that frighten you, that idea? Why would it frighten you after you die? The same nothingness, an infinity of nothing. Why would that frighten you? Any more the infinity of nothingness that comes before your birth. No reason to fear nothingness. You can only fear something, says Socrates. So that's one option. Or, says Socrates, the poets and the myth makers are right. That after we die, our soul migrates into some afterlife, some heavenly realm. In which case, the gods, being just, they would never impose harm on us needlessly. So this afterlife would probably be a good thing, says Socrates. So there's one of two options for Socrates. Nothingness, you shouldn't be afraid of that. Or an afterlife, you shouldn't be afraid of that either. So since we're ignorant of what happens after we die, we shouldn't suppose death to be a great evil, says Socrates. But we do know something that is a great evil, living impiously. We do know that we can do a lot of things wrong when we live. We know that some of those things are evil. Some of those things are immoral. Some of those things should be feared. Like the fear of not living a contemplative life. Like the fear of not living a philosophical life. That's something you should fear, says Socrates, because we know that's bad for you. We know that's not the pathway to a good life, to a happy life. So Socrates makes a decision that it would be better for him to die virtuously as a philosopher than to live impiously and dishonorably as somebody who's not devoted to the contemplative life, not devoted to the life of examination. Between these two choices, Socrates knows what he's going to do. After death? I don't know. Is that bad? I don't know. I'm ignorant of that. But I do know some things about this life, says Socrates. That the unexamined life is not worth living. That's why he would rather die as a philosopher than continue to live in a noble death as an ignorant person who does not consider philosophy seriously. And that's what he says in this lovely passage. Yes, it's a large passage, folk. I'm going to read it all because it's my favorite passage from Plato. You are mistaken, my friend, he says to his fellow jurymen. You are mistaken if you think that a man who is worth anything ought to spend his time weighing up the prospects of life and death. A good man has only one thing to consider in performing any action, and that is whether he is acting rightly or wrongly, not weighing up the prospects of life and death, but whether you're acting rightly or wrongly. A good person takes no account of death or anything else before dishonor. Famous phrase from Socrates. I care naught, says Socrates, of anything about death before dishonor. I'd rather continue to live the philosophical life than I'd rather die as a philosopher than continue to live a life of the sort that his jurymen live, an ignorant life, a life of dishonor. You are wrong if if you think the good person takes account of anything about death or anything else before dishonor. Now, what sort of person would I be when God appointed me to be a gadfly, when God appointed me to the duty of leading this philosophical life, if I were to then, through the fear of death or any other danger, desert my post to which God has assigned me? Here's Socrates saying, you're accusing me of impiety. You're accusing me of not believing in the gods. On the contrary, says Socrates, I'm following the will of the gods. The gods, the oracle at Delphi, my daimon, Apollo himself, have sent me on this divine mission as a gadfly of Athens. If I deserted this post as a philosopher, as the gadfly of Athens, then I might really, with justice, be summoned into court for not believing in the gods. No, none amongst us, no one knows with regard to death whether it is not really the greatest blessing that can happen to a man. We could have an afterlife, eternal paradise. But yet people dread it as though they were certain that it is the greatest evil. Now, if I were to claim to be wiser than my neighbor in any respect, it is in this, that in not possessing any real knowledge of what happens after death, I am conscious that I do not possess it. I know that I know nothing. Whereas you folks who are afraid of dying, you think you know something that you do not in fact know. Socrates is not afraid of dying. Oh, and the people will say that philosophy serves no purpose. Really? What could be a higher purpose than overcoming the fear of death so that you might live well? That's not a practical purpose. Huh? That's not worth doing in your life. What else would be worth doing in your life? Heaping up gold coins? Huh? Pursuing a life of pleasure? That's more worthwhile than your life? And philosophy serves no purpose. Philosophy is not important to study. You think about that when you're lying awake at night, after you lose your friends or family, after you confront this crippling fear of death that so many of us have. You consider that question once more, students. That's what I'd ask of you. Yeah, when you're lying awake in the dark at nighttime, cowering, fearful, paralyzed by that fear of death. Not Socrates. Folks, in my judgment, there's only two things that can disburden us, disabuse us of this rather crippling fear of death, as I put it. There's only two things: religion, and I'm not religious, but I will admit that religion helps many people overcome the fear of death. And the only other thing is philosophy. Philosophy and religion. Those are the only two things that can help you as an individual grapple, out-wrestle this otherwise paralyzing fear of our own mortality. I've seen it happen, folks, in my own life when I've lost people I've cared about. I've seen it happen in the lives of my colleagues and friends, like my dear former professor, Professor Ted Winslow. He's still alive, but he faced many years ago a bout with cancer, which we assumed was terminal. We thought he would likely die from it. Never once did I see him cry. Never once did I see him lament. Never once did I see him whimper, oh, the fear of death. No, he lived as a philosopher should. I've never seen an example of a living practice of philosophy like I did with my dear professor when he confronted his own mortality, the prospect of his own imminent death. He wasn't shaken. He didn't lament. He didn't go crying and kicking into that good night. He had lived well. He had lived a philosophical life, and nothing, not even the prospect of his own death, would shake him from that position, which would disturb him from that philosophical enterprise. I've seen it happen in my life and in the lives of those I know, that philosophy can relieve you of this otherwise crippling fear of death that so many of us face. Philosophy serves no purpose. Yeah. One of the reasons why Socrates doesn't fear death is because he believes that the good person cannot be harmed. Now, let's say you're a good person and I punch you in the face. You're going to say, well, that's not the harm that Socrates is talking about, folks. He doesn't deny that your body can be harmed, but that's not what you should be caring about. Remember what he says, don't care about possessions and your body. Care about the welfare of your soul. And folks, no one can harm the well-being of your soul except yourself. Your soul, so to speak, for Socrates, is like an impenetrable fortress. And it can only be invaded, so to speak, if you open the gates to the foreigners. If you open the gates to pleasure and vice, to money and fame and reputation and those sorts of desires. If you open the well-being of your soul to that, then yes, it will corrupt you. Yes, you will cause yourself harm, but nobody else can cause harm to your mental and moral well-being, to the welfare of your own soul. Only you can harm yourself in that sense. And so the easiest way to prevent evil, says Socrates, is to make yourselves as good men would. Nobody can harm you. Nobody can harm the good person. The good cannot be harmed. Nothing can harm a good man, either in life or after death. Not sickness, not poverty, not ill repute, a bad reputation. None of that can harm you unless you let it harm you, folks. Nothing can harm a good person, either in life or in death. There's only one life worth living, the philosophical life. It will disabuse you of the fear of your own mortality. It will help you overcome the fear of death. Misfortune, suffering, misery, poverty, sickness, death, none of that, jail sentences, none of that can affect the good person, the good philosopher, says Socrates. None of that can prevent you from living an enviable life, a good life, a life worth living. Again, the only thing that can harm you is yourself. The good person cannot be harmed. I assure you, my fellow countrymen, that if I am what I claim to be, and you put me to death, you will in fact harm yourselves more than me. I do not believe that the law of the gods permits a better man to be harmed by the worse. And no doubt, my accusers might put me to death today, but whether death is a great calamity, I do not think so. I believe it would be far worse to do what my accusers are doing right now, namely, putting an innocent man to death. By putting me, an innocent man, says Socrates, to death, you're harming the virtue of your own soul, the well-being of your own morality and your own moral character. You're not harming me, says Socrates. Yeah, you're killing my body. You're not harming me, my true self, my inner soul, my mental and moral character. You're harming yourself. You're harming your own mental and moral character. You're harming the well-being of your own soul by putting an innocent man to death. And for this reason, says Socrates, in my defense speech, far from pleading on my behalf, as might usually be supposed, I'm really pleading on your behalf. I'm not defending myself in my defense speech. I'm defending the life of philosophy, not my own life, but the life of philosophy, the philosophical life. I'm not really pleading on my behalf, but on yours. You can see why it pisses all the jurymen off, right? Here is Socrates continually doing this. I've been sent on this divine mission. You won't easily replace me. I'm not really pleading on my behalf. I'm pleading on yours. You know, Socrates says, oh, you folks, I know what you want me to do. I know how you're going to let me off. You want me to parade my wife, tears in her eyes before the court. You want me to parade my children and say, but Socrates has children. And you want me to do that in order for you to take mercy upon me. I won't give you the benefit. I won't give you that joy, says Socrates. I'm going to defend the life of philosophy rather than my own life. I'm going to plead on your behalf rather than mine. Let no day, says Socrates, pass without discussing goodness. And here is the Crito, folks. Another dialogue by Plato. This is an artistic representation. Here is Socrates pointing to the heavens, about to drink the poison cup of hemlock. And the context of this dialogue by Plato, the Crito, is that his friends, who you see gathered around him, his friends have bribed his jailers. They've bribed the jailers so that the jailers might allow Socrates to flee the prison. And Socrates refuses to go. He feels duty bound to the city of Athens, the same city that condemned an innocent man to death. He would not desert his post, he says. Then he really would be rightfully dragged before the courts for disbelieving in the gods. No, I won't desert my post. You're mistaken, my friend, if you think that a man who's worth anything ought to weigh up the prospects of life and death. He has only one thing to consider in doing any action, whether he's acting rightly or wrongly. He cares not an inkling about death before dishonor. And so Socrates gladly drinks from the hemlock cup.